Hi there, I'm Joyce Graff. I'm the quilting instructor at the Brookline Senior Center in Brookline, Massachusetts. And today we're talking about paper piecing, some trees, and some animals. We're going to add some animals and trees to the community quilt neighborhood that we're putting together. So I'm going to share some slides with you. I made up this pattern in advance and took some pictures as I went along, so I'll share that with you as we go forward. And you can see that this is part of the community quilt project that we're launching at the Brookline Senior Center. Here's the concept for it, and here's one of the blocks. This is the block we're going to be talking about making today. And we've talked about the housing blocks. Those are on our set of recordings that are on YouTube. If you go to bit.ly BSC for Brookline Senior Center 93, we're at 93 Winchester Street, and then I put these extensions on for the various handouts, and our YouTube channel is at BSC 93-quilting. So you can find all of our videos there. And don't forget that all these patterns are suggestions and guidelines. Nothing is a requirement. You can let your creativity flow. And today's lesson, as a matter of fact, is going to talk some about ways that you can be creative. So this particular pattern is about making trees for our neighborhood. The requirements are that it be a 10.5-inch square. So that's 10 inches square that you will actually see in the quilt, and the other ½ inch is the seam allowances all the way around. It does need to be all fabric, please, and we are making a bed quilt, so everything that you put on it needs to be washable and secure. Please don't add buttons or beads or anything like that. It needs to be embroidery or applique or another quilting technique, because we want it to be smooth to the touch and washable and secure. When you're making things for a wall hanging, you can put more bling on it, but for what we're doing for this particular quilt, we would like to make it washable. So the first thing to do after you've printed out the pattern is to measure the pattern and make sure that it's the right size, because not all printers print things exactly to size. So you're going to measure from the colored part to the other end of the colored part. This is the height of the page, and that should measure 10 inches. So this will be the finished part of the square. Plus, we're going to have to add some seam allowance. And so you'll add a 1/4 inch seam allowance on every edge. Notice that the paper is 8.5-inch wide, and this particular piece is 8.5 inches wide. So there may be a little printer margin. There may be some white before you get to the edge of the paper, but this pattern goes to the edge of the paper. Your finished piece should be 8.5 inches wide and 10 inches tall. And then we're going to add the seam allowances on all sides. And in this case, the seam allowance is beyond the paper. So beyond the colored part, and in this case, beyond the edge of the paper, even if the printer didn't print that last 1/8 of an inch to the edge of the paper. Okay? And then the tree trunks are on a different strip. Also needs to be 10 inches this way. So we're going to start with that segment A, which is the tree trunks, and it's just sky, trunk, sky, trunk, sky, trunk. It's very straightforward paper piecing. You put pieces 1 and 2 together, then you flatten this out and you add piece 3, and you flatten it out and add piece 4. So we've done a lot of paper piecing before, so I won't bore you with every little detail here, but you need to just add those with paper piecing. If you're doing this by hand, sewing through the paper is not a reasonable thing to do. So just pre-cut the pieces, but do remember that whenever you have a seam, there's a 1/2 inch of fabric in that seam, a 1/4 inch of brown and a 1/4 inch of sky. So when you cut this piece, if you measure it and cut this piece, add a 1/2 inch, add a 1/2 inch in all directions so that you'll have seam allowance, okay? And then when you cut the brown one, you'll measure this, add a 1/2 inch so that you will have some for the seams on all sides, okay? Creating the tree trunks. This is our finished piece. And now we'll go ahead and make the trees. Now, angles are always a little bit more tricky. And the first question is, what kind of a piece of fabric are you going to need for this? How do you cut the fabric? Well, we're going to need a piece of fabric that will be the longest dimension of this tree, which is this one. This is where we're going to sew our seam. So we need to measure this, the distance of the piece, plus your seam allowance on both ends. You'll measure that width. And the height needs to be like this, because this is going to be your sky. We're measuring for the sky piece. The sky is going to need to attach over here, have a seam allowance, and then when you fold it back, it needs to go all the way past this peak plus seam allowance, right? So we're going to measure it up this way. And again, if you're going to be paper piecing, I would suggest making it pretty generous. And as a matter of fact, you might want to think in terms of, what am I going to do with the leftovers? You see this white part here? Could we use that for here? If we make this maybe a 1/2 inch bigger, you probably will have enough for this end. But if you limit it exactly to what you need here, it's going to be short. So I would keep this piece kind of generous. Sometimes I don't even cut it. I'll just make sure I have the right dimension. And then maybe this goes on for a foot or two beyond here. Don't even cut it so that I'm sure to have plenty for the next piece that I need. And then the green piece also, we want to make sure that we have this green piece long enough. This is our seam, so it's the same line here. But then we need to measure to make sure that the green will cover this peak. Okay, so that's for paper piecing. Now, I gave you the template in the pattern, so we could just work from the templates. And if you do that, it'll be very similar. You're going to cut out the templates, but make sure that you've got a seam allowance all the way around each piece. All the way, I've got it marked here, so you remember to add a 1/4 of an inch. Now here, you would cut into one of those two trees. So what I did was just slice it right along here to separate the two trees. And then you'll see me working with the pattern piece as you go along. So two things to remember from this slide. First of all, when you can read the pattern, you are looking at the back side of the finished piece. And in some places that matters more than others. Even though this is an isosceles triangle, let's just do all the pieces this way. Here, this particular piece really wouldn't matter very much, but when we get to the sky pieces, I'll show you it really does matter. So here we're going to just routinely, when you use a template in your paper piecing, or foundation piecing, I'm saying paper, but foundation piecing is the same thing. It's just on fabric instead of paper. So you pin the template to the back of the fabric, and here I flipped it back so you can see the difference between the front of the fabric and the back of the fabric. It has more white. So we're going to cut it a little bit bigger than we really need, just to give us a little wiggle room. And we're going to do it on the back of the fabric. So now I'm going to use my ruler. See, I've just laid the pattern. I just separated it, laid it on top of the back side of the fabric. And now I'm using my ruler to set the offset. So, and I could just roller cut right along there. If I'm doing it by hand, I just want the 1/4 inch. If I'm doing it as paper piecing, I'm cutting a 1/2 inch seam allowance to give myself a little more wiggle room, because you need to make sure that you're going to cover this point. And if you get it just a little too short, you're going to be very unhappy, because then you get to cut another piece of fabric. So don't be cheap about that 1/4 inch here, or you might lose the whole piece. So now pin the pattern to the back side of the fabric, and on the sky, it's a little hard to tell the front from the back, but we're on the back side of the fabric. And this way we make sure that these 2 pieces are going to be the right size in the right place. That's why we're doing it from the back. And I'll show you as we go along. But just remember, when you can read the pattern, you're looking at the back side of the finished work. Now that we've got our trees together, I'm going to take a break and do something different. This is the freezer paper method that we've talked about before. This is a piece of freezer paper. You can see I cut it off just like wax paper with the cutter on the box. And I folded it this way just to show you the difference between the paper side and the glossy side. The glossy side has a plastic or a wax feel to it, and we're going to use that quality for different things, but for drawing on it, we'll use the paper side. So now you just draw whatever shape you want, and I decided I would put a cloud in amongst my trees. So I sketched out this cloud. Doesn't have to be glorious, and I used a big felt tip marker just so you could see it, but you can do it with a pencil or a pen or a ballpoint, anything you want to. It writes just like paper. And I cut that out, so I have it, and I just sort of tried it out in place. Yeah, that looks about right. So that's the shape that I'm going to want. Then I looked in my shoebox. This is what I call my animal parts box. When I do paper piecing, I need a little bit of this and that. Here it looks like an alligator. These are good colors for birds, and different browns and grays. In manageable size pieces. So in this shoebox, I keep things that are no more than about 1 foot square. And right now I'm looking for a cloud, so I'm going to see what white pieces I have in my animal parts box. And I found something here. It's an all over print. Looks like the thing that you might be in the cloud. And I took the freezer paper, put the waxy side down on the front of the fabric so that I can cut it out. So the waxy side down, and my drawing is up. So this is what I want to be on the front, and this is the face. The front is also facing up, facing up, facing up. And I ironed it down. It sticks. So now it's firmly attached to the fabric, and I can cut around that really easily with my scissors. And be sure to leave 1/4 inch extra beyond my drawing so that I'll have something to turn. Now I've taken it apart, turned it over. Now I'm looking at the back side of the fabric and the back side, or the paper side, back side of my cloud, which is the waxy side. The wrong side of the fabric, and the waxy side is up. And we're going to use that waxy quality here in just a second. You'll see why I did it that way. But now you can see it fits perfectly. And we're going to begin to turn the edges. So the first thing I did was to turn just a little bit on both ends, just to hold it in place, because I don't want it to wiggle around and fall off the edge of my cloud. So I turned some here, I turned some here, just to press it and hold it in place. And it sticks to the freezer paper. So the waxy side up is catching this, and I'm ironing down, and it sticks to the waxy side of the freezer paper. And now I'm going on around. So you can see as I go around here, when I get to this place I have to notch the fabric. So every inside curve, we've talked about that, every inside curve needs to be notched, and especially these sort of hard turns, if you will. I have to clip that so that I can turn it well. And when it's an outside curve, it'll just fold a little bit in various places as you go around, and just keep going around with your iron. In the video that I showed you before, we saw her using a mini iron. That's very nice, but it's not totally necessary. And I use just a regular iron, and it's a little awkward sometimes, but you can do it. And we don't do it so often that we need a separate tool. So I just cope. And we have a cloud. So this is turned. You can see it's holding in place because of our freezer paper, and it's pretty much the shape that I want. And I've put it on front of my tree. And now I'm going to make the trees. I'm joining pieces 1 and 2. So I've got the 2 pieces of fabric under here with the right sides together so that our seam will hold it. And this is where I want the seam. And I use my guide pins to set it where I want it. Now I'm looking on the back. And, oh, there are a couple little adjustments I need to make. This is why I go through that guide pin business, because now I can see that this seam is a little short here, a little long there. So I'm going to adjust it, and here it's not completely flat. So we're going to make some changes. That's better. So now I've got it where I want it, and I can sew that seam and keep on going, adding piece, adding piece, adding piece. Here's our last piece. And now that I have it all assembled, I'm going to trim it. Notice that the seam allowance goes beyond the edge of the paper, even though we have this, it's called a printer margin, where the printer just doesn't print that last 1/8 of an inch before the edge of the paper. Printers normally have a print margin. But this pattern does go all the way to the edge of the paper. So our seam allowance is beyond the edge of the paper. Here it's short of the edge of the paper. So, and you can see I left a sort of generous seam allowance on the outsides. I like to do that, and then I have a little extra to play with. So now that we have our trees all assembled, we're going to take off the paper. We don't need the paper anymore. We've got it trimmed to size. And we'll try out our clouds. So how does that look to you? Does that look like it ought to look? So picture yourself standing across the street, looking at this tree, and there's a cloud. What's wrong with that cloud? It might be above the tree, but it's almost certainly not in front of the tree. It's probably behind the tree, right? So how are we going to get that cloud behind the tree so it looks a little bit more realistic, more like it ought to be? What are our possibilities? One possibility is just to open up this seam and slide it under. So what I did was I used my seam ripper and I opened up this seam and this seam so I could slide it in, and there it is. So I opened up this seam, opened up this seam, and I just slid that cloud right in, paper and all, just slide it right across, and now I can wiggle it and get it to where I want it, adjust it, and then I'll pin it in the position that I want. So at this point, what you're working on is making sure that the background is totally flat and that the cloud is in the position that you want it to be in. And here you can see on the back that I've just slid it right through. There's my open seam, here's my open seam, and the cloud is just sitting there. Okay. So when we're happy with it, then I went ahead and sewed. This is the blind stitching, my permanent blind stitching by hand, all the way around the cloud. And my beginning knot and my ending knot are both in the seam of the sky piece, not the tree, just the sky piece. So all the stitching is between the cloud and the sky. The green is just hanging there, okay? And now I laid it down again to just check and make sure everything's nice and flat and that this guy is pinned in the right place, because the objective at this point is that we want this piece to be very flat. And now I'll sew around this right-hand side of the cloud, and everything is nice and flat. And again, my starting knot and my stopping knot are both in the seam allowance on the sky. Now we flip it over, and on the back, what I did was I cut this cloud piece in two. So just slip my scissors under there and cut through the paper and the fabric to separate it now into two parts. And then I'm going to pull out the paper. So just pull that out. And so all the stitching that I did, you can see my blind stitching here. It just notched the paper a tiny bit, just almost perforated that edge. But I didn't really go into the paper. You don't sew through the paper. You just use the paper to hold the shape, and you just sew right around the edge of it. And then I was surprised myself. It just pulled right out. No problem at all. No tugging. It just pulled right out. So I'll take out this piece and this piece. So now the paper is gone. And then I turned it and laid it flat. This is the seam, the original seam. We got the cloud sticking through it now because we put it in the middle. Folded that seam, and now we're going to sew that seam line back in place. Keep it all nice and flat and smooth. And once we've done that, then we can trim that seam so that we don't have that cloud sticking out anymore. And we'll do the same thing on the other side. And then we take the paper off of the tree trunk piece and put it together, and our block is finished. So here we have our cloud behind the tree where it belongs. I'll just point out too that this piece of fabric and this piece of fabric are the same fabric, and I just turned it a different way to make it look a little different. But you can see it looks really nice with the different prints of green, so you can add a lot of character to your slide just by changing up the fabric. So that's it for adding trees and things like that, like that cloud. You can add any shape that you want, make it yours, and let your imagination soar. So thanks very much for participating in our community quilt, and we'll have another program for you next week to talk about adding animals to the quilt. Thanks so much. It was great to have you with us. Bye now.